The news hit like a thunderbolt. Camilla Parker Bowles just had her Windsor Castle access permanently revoked by a dead woman. And the way it happened is honestly more brutal than anything I've seen on a Netflix drama. The announcement didn't come from a balcony. It didn't come from a speech. It didn't come from some carefully worded palace press release. It came from a solicitor standing in front of a silent table holding a sealed document with Queen Elizabeth's private signature on it. And within minutes, Camilla's entire future at Windsor was just gone. The late Queen left behind a permanent clause. And here's the key detail that makes this whole thing inescapable. No king, no courtier, no royal marriage can overturn it. That's not a suggestion. That's not a preference. That's a legally binding instruction designed to survive changes of reign, changes of title, changes of household structure, everything. So right there, before anyone even opened their mouth, the outcome was already decided. Picture this room. Palace solicitors summoned King Charles, Prince William, Princess Anne, and Camilla into Windsor's administrative wing after archivists authenticated a sealed addendum to the late Queen's estate instructions. An addendum is basically a legally attached addition to an existing document, and this one carried the force of a private command. Windsor mattered here because it's not just a residence. It represents continuity, family authority, the late monarch's entire legacy. The senior solicitor opened the file and spoke without any ornament, without softening anything. And nobody in that room dared challenge the wording aloud. Queen Elizabeth's clause permanently blocked Camilla, the queen consort, from living at Windsor, from holding private apartments there, from exercising any household authority inside the castle. Charles didn't interrupt. His fingers tightened against the table because he understood something that probably hit him like a freight train in that moment. Even as the monarch, he couldn't cancel what his mother had designed to outlast him. Camilla at first assumed the restriction was about ceremony, like maybe she couldn't host certain events or stand in certain positions during formal occasions. But then the lawyer clarified the actual ban, and it's so much more comprehensive than that. No overnight stays, no private office, no power over staff appointments. And this is the part that really lands. No future widowhood arrangement within Windsor's walls. They literally planned ahead for what would happen if Charles died first. They made sure she couldn't stay there even then. Her face changed when that sank in. This rejection wasn't temporary and it wasn't symbolic. It reached into every single future she had imagined beside the king. Anne noticed there was a second sealed page beneath the first one. She asked what it contained, but the solicitor refused to reveal it until everyone in that room formally acknowledged the restriction. William stayed still, but his glance toward the Princess Royal suggested he understood more than he was saying out loud. And then Camilla did something that I think tells you exactly where her head was at. She reached into her handbag, removed her Windsor access card, and placed it sharply on the polished table. Just click. Right there, the solicitor slid it back toward her and quietly explained that palace security would deactivate it before sunset. Anyway, she pushed back her chair and demanded to know why the late Queen had distrusted her so completely. Charles looked down. William looked toward Anne, and somewhere behind their silence was an incident the family had buried for years. The clause had closed Windsor's gates, but the deeper wound wasn't the restriction itself. It was knowing that Queen Elizabeth had expected this exact confrontation long before anyone else saw it coming. For Charles, Windsor was never just stone and ceremony and royal tradition. It was memory. It was duty. It was the place where his mother carried the monarchy through its darkest hours. And now the woman he loved had been legally separated from that inheritance by the mother he still mourns. One signature placed him between two loyalties, and whichever side he chose was going to feel like betrayal. He'd spent years trying to bring his marriage into harmony with the crown, hoping that patience and service and public acceptance had finally secured Camilla's place within royal life. But Windsor carries a completely different meaning for everyone caught in this dispute. To the king, it holds his mother's presence. To William, it represents continuity, that unbroken transfer of duty from one reign to the next. To Anne, it demands obedience, and to Camilla, it had become the final proof that she truly belonged. She waited until they were alone before speaking. Her anger had faded into something quieter and more painful. Charles tried to explain that defying the clause could provoke a family rupture and a constitutional crisis, meaning a conflict over whether the monarch could ignore a binding instruction tied to royal property and household authority. But she didn't hear a legal argument. She heard hesitation. She heard a husband preparing to surrender her future to the judgment of a woman who was no longer there to defend or explain it. Camilla asked whether she would always remain a tolerated outsider, even after decades of loyalty beside him. The king opened his mouth, then stopped. That pause wounded her more than any harsh answer could have. She asked whether he would leave Windsor with her that evening. He looked toward the closed door and said softly that he had to remain for the next legal briefing. She nodded once, but the silence between them carried accusation and grief and defeat. William found Anne in a nearby corridor and lowered his voice. The prince believed the clause had been written not simply to exclude Camilla, but to prevent a future transfer of control after Charles became king. Anne admitted that her mother had once warned her that royal residences were rarely taken through ownership. They were captured quietly through staff appointments, private offices, guest lists, security access, control over daily routines. Piece by piece, authority could shift before anyone publicly acknowledged it. That's actually the most insightful part of this whole thing because it reframes everything. It wasn't about whether Camilla was nice or mean or popular. It was about whether the operational control of Windsor could silently change hands through 1,000 small administrative decisions. Charles returned to the legal room and demanded the confidential history behind the restriction. The solicitor opened a separate file and revealed that one Windsor ceremony had permanently changed Queen Elizabeth's view of Camilla. His decision to stay behind for that briefing didn't end their marriage, but it reopened an older fracture, one that began on the exact night Queen Elizabeth decided Windsor could never safely pass into Camilla's hands. Years before the solicitors ever opened that sealed instruction, Windsor had witnessed a private confrontation that almost no one understood at the time. It happened after a memorial reception when a disputed guest list, a locked apartment, and one unauthorized order reached Queen Elizabeth within minutes of each other. By midnight, the monarch had made a decision that would outlive her, and one woman's future inside the castle was already over. Here's what was happening behind the scenes. Camilla's household had been expanding its reach slowly during the final years of the Queen's reign. Requests kept arriving. More office space, greater access to guest suites, a stronger voice in ceremonial planning, closer control over private staff ahead of the succession. Queen Elizabeth allowed limited cooperation, but she refused to let Windsor's authority shift before the crown formally passed to Charles. To her, the castle wasn't simply a home. It was a living center of command, and even small changes could reveal who believed the next reign had already begun. The breaking point came after a private memorial reception for Prince Philip. Camilla instructed a senior housekeeper to prepare the former East Terrace rooms for her personal use during a future royal gathering. The order was given without the monarch's approval. Those rooms carried deep family meaning because they had belonged to Elizabeth's private household, and changing their use would have signaled more than just comfort. It would have suggested succession before surrender. The housekeeper approached the Queen after the reception, shaken and uncertain, and asked whether she truly intended to give up the rooms while she was still living. Elizabeth understood immediately. She summoned Camilla privately and asked who had authorized the decision. The future queen consort answered that she was only planning for continuity. But the monarch heard something colder in those words. She heard a claim being made before permission had been offered. Queen Elizabeth took the proposed room assignment sheet, folded it once without reading it aloud, and placed it beneath the silver paper weight before telling Camilla, "These rooms are not waiting for you." That same evening, Elizabeth called Anne to her side and dictated the first version of the Windsor restriction. She explained that service beside the sovereign did not automatically give anyone guardianship over royal inheritance. Later, palace solicitors strengthened the wording and added a clause preventing any future king from granting Camilla residential power through a new warrant, which is basically an official written authority issued by the monarch. Months afterward, Charles learned that his mother had raised a serious warning. He chose silence, hoping the anger would fade. Instead, the warning became law. The clause was born from that single sentence. But when Camilla learned that Charles had known there was a warning and kept silent, Windsor's legal dispute became a deeply personal confrontation. She could endure the judgment of solicitors, the cold language of sealed clauses, even the humiliation of surrendering her access. What she could not endure was learning that Charles had once been warned. Behind closed doors, the legal dispute became a marital reckoning. No aid stood between them. No prepared statement softened the truth. There was only anger and grief and a question the king had avoided for years. Camilla carried the historical file into a private drawing room and placed it before Charles with both hands. Her voice stayed controlled at first, but the restraint made the accusation sharper. She demanded to know when he had first learned that Queen Elizabeth was considering restrictions on her Windsor role. The king admitted that his mother had raised concerns about household boundaries, meaning limits on who could control rooms, staff, access, and daily decisions inside a royal residence. He insisted that he never saw the final clause, and believed the disagreement had ended after the East Terrace incident. Camilla refused to accept that. She reminded him of the years she had spent beside him through scandal, rejection, public anger, private humiliation. Now she said he was protecting the memory of the late queen, while leaving the living woman beside him to carry the punishment alone. Charles answered that defending her couldn't mean destroying his mother's final instruction. William and Anne viewed the clause as a direct command to protect Windsor's institutional identity, the castle's role as a symbol of continuity beyond any marriage or reign. Then Camilla revealed what no one in the legal room had known. She had already approved preliminary plans for a permanent Windsor office, including staff transfers and a private communications suite, believing the king would formalize everything later. Charles stared at her. The plans made the late monarch's fears look less like suspicion and more like prophecy. William entered only after hearing their voices rise. The prince confirmed that every proposed transfer had been frozen. Camilla turned on him immediately, accusing the future king of using his grandmother's clause to speed up her removal. He denied acting from revenge, but his calmness only deepened her fury. Camilla asked Charles to look her in the eye and promise he would overturn the clause. He reached toward her, but she stepped back, and the space between them became the answer. Neither was willing to speak. Anne arrived carrying the second sealed page. She didn't hand it to Charles. Instead, she placed it before the solicitor and waited. Their confrontation exposed the marriage beneath the monarchy. But that second sealed page was about to reveal that emotional loyalty no longer determined who controlled Windsor's future. The second page didn't offer sympathy or explanation or compromise. It named the guardian. Queen Elizabeth had anticipated that Charles might one day face an impossible conflict between his wife and his inheritance, so she removed the final decision from him entirely. The authority to enforce the Windsor Clause belonged to the one royal she trusted to act without sentiment, without hesitation, without fear of personal consequence. Princess Anne. Anne didn't celebrate. She stood beside the solicitor as he explained that she had been appointed permanent family custodian of the restriction, meaning she carried the duty to challenge any household order designed to bypass the late Queen's command. Her authority didn't make her owner of Windsor or place her above the sovereign. It gave her one narrow but decisive responsibility: protecting residential access, private apartments, and household appointments connected to Camilla. Charles absorbed the meaning in silence. His mother had trusted his sister to enforce a decision she believed he might be too emotionally divided to carry out himself. That knowledge cut deeper than the legal language. The king was still sovereign, yet within this single matter his judgment had been limited by someone who had known his weaknesses better than anyone. Anne turned toward her brother and told him she felt no triumph. She would surrender the burden immediately, she said, if doing so would not betray their mother's final wishes. Charles looked at her and understood that she was suffering too. Duty had not spared the Princess Royal. It had simply denied her the freedom to choose comfort. The solicitor continued, explaining that Camilla could attend ceremonies at Windsor only as an invited consort with approval required for every single visit. Repeated attendance could never become a claim to residence. Then Anne uncovered something worse. Several recent staffing requests had been specifically designed to create a permanent Queen Consorts unit inside the castle. Such a unit would have placed offices, aides, communications, and daily household control under Camilla without formally granting her private rooms. It was exactly the kind of quiet power transfer Queen Elizabeth had warned about. Anne signed an immediate suspension order. Offices would be cancelled. Staff transfers would be revoked. Every arrangement linked to the proposed unit had to be dismantled before morning. She placed the enforcement document before Charles, turned the pen toward him, and waited. After a long silence, the king signed acknowledgement while his sister kept one hand flat against the page. When the room emptied, Anne remained behind. She stared at her mother's signature, tears gathering before she folded the document and returned to duty. The authority had finally been identified, but the moment Anne enforced it, the clause stopped being an old family secret and began reshaping lives throughout Windsor Castle. By dawn, Windsor was already changing. Doors that had opened automatically now required written approval. Staff who expected new assignments received cancellation notices. A private office prepared for Camilla was emptied before she could enter it. The clause was no longer a sentence hidden inside a sealed file. It had become a physical reality measured in removed photographs, returned keys, silent corridors, and one royal departure no one could disguise. The suspension order moved through the castle before breakfast. Security teams received new access rules. Household managers canceled room allocations. Transportation staff removed Windsor from Camilla's private schedule, while the king's private secretary was instructed to separate her operations from the castle immediately. The order didn't strip away her ceremonial role. She could still attend formal engagements beside Charles, but every residential privilege, unsupervised visit, staffing power, and personal use of Windsor facilities had ended. Camilla entered the office that had been prepared for her future team and stopped. The desks had been cleared. Communication equipment was gone. Only a small box of personal stationery remained beside the door. Her longtime aide offered to challenge the decision publicly, arguing that silence would make the humiliation look deserved. She refused. An open attack on Queen Elizabeth's instruction would isolate Charles, harden William, and force Anne to defend the clause even more aggressively. Security officials delivered the next blow with careful formality. Even during state occasions, the Queen Consort would be required to leave after the official program unless Anne granted exceptional written permission. A state occasion means a formal event carried out in the name of the crown, but the explanation offered no comfort. Camilla could enter as part of the monarchy and still be forbidden to remain as family. Charles searched desperately for another route. He asked whether a private apartment could be created under a different household name, perhaps attached to his own office rather than hers. The solicitor answered that the clause had anticipated that exact move. No renamed apartment, no secondary suite, no sovereign warrant could restore residential control at the castle entrance. Camilla handed her key ring to the security officer, but one small brass key remained caught around her finger. She removed it slowly, placed it in his palm, and walked toward the waiting car without looking back. Charles watched from an upper corridor. He raised one hand toward the window, then let it fall when he realized she couldn't see him. Before the car departed, William sent a message asking to speak with Camilla alone. The request carried no explanation. It could lead to another rejection or the first honest peace Windsor had offered. Windsor had enforced the Queen's judgment with brutal precision. Yet one private conversation still had the power to determine whether the family would emerge divided or finally understand what the clause was meant to protect. William didn't meet Camilla as an heir confronting a defeated consort. He met her as a son who understood what it meant to live beneath the weight of the past. With no lawyers, no aides, no family witnesses present, they sat across from each other inside a small room beyond Windsor's private chapel. For the first time, the argument moved away from access and authority and toward the wounds neither had ever named. William had requested the meeting because he believed continued humiliation would damage Charles, fracture the family, and turn Queen Elizabeth's protective clause into an act of revenge. A protective clause is a binding instruction created to guard a specific royal interest, but he knew its purpose could be corrupted if the family used it to punish rather than protect. Camilla arrived expecting another demand. Instead, the prince began by acknowledging that the restriction did not erase her years of service or her place beside the king. Camilla lowered her guard slowly. Losing Windsor, she admitted, hurt because it confirmed her oldest fear. No amount of loyalty, duty, or public endurance could free her from the judgments surrounding the beginning of her relationship with Charles. She had survived scandal and rejection. Yet one sealed page had made the past feel permanent. William didn't dismiss her pain. He explained that Windsor carried memories of his grandmother, the suffering of his mother, and the monarchy he would one day inherit. Every proposed office, every staff transfer, every private suite felt personal, even when presented as simple administration. To him, the castle wasn't territory to be claimed. It was a trust to be preserved. Then the future king offered a settlement. Camilla would retain full ceremonial dignity and receive an independent household elsewhere, while Windsor's private guardianship would remain with the direct line of succession, meaning the heirs who inherit the crown in order. She agreed not to challenge the clause, provided the palace did not describe her departure as punishment or destroy the careers of loyal staff. Camilla asked whether William believed Queen Elizabeth had hated her. He paused before answering. The late monarch, he said, feared what power might do to the family. She had not denied Camilla's humanity. Before leaving, the Queen Consort touched the back of the empty chair beside her and quietly said she wished that conversation had happened years earlier when forgiveness might have cost him less. William promised to take the agreement directly to Charles. Then he warned her that details from the solicitors' meeting had already reached the press. The private settlement prevented a family war, but outside Windsor's walls, the secret clause was already becoming a national judgment on memory and marriage and the limits of royal power. At sunrise, the secret left the palace. Britain woke up to a royal restriction unlike any announced in modern memory. A reigning queen consort permanently barred from making Windsor Castle her home. The public didn't receive the story as a technical dispute. They saw a final command from Queen Elizabeth, a rebuke delivered across time, and a family forced to confront wounds the crown had spent decades trying to contain. The palace moved quickly, issuing a formal statement before speculation could outrun control. It confirmed that the late monarch had created a binding private residential instruction and that Charles, William, Anne, and Camilla had agreed to respect it. A residential instruction is a legally protected direction governing who can live in or exercise private authority over royal property. The wording sounded calm. Its meaning was devastating. Broadcasters explained that Camilla remained queen consort and would continue her public duties beside the king. Yet Windsor's apartments, household structure, staffing decisions, and long-term guardianship would remain beyond her reach. Supporters of Elizabeth praised the clause's protection for the crown. Others called it a final humiliation imposed on a woman who had spent decades supporting Charles through hostility and scandal and relentless judgment. Charles watched the coverage without speaking. Commentators repeatedly framed the decision as his mother's victory over his wife, turning private grief into a public contest between two women he loved. The king refused to react, but Anne understood the pain beneath his silence. She later appeared beside her brother at an official engagement, standing close enough to make one message unmistakable. The siblings remained united even after their mother's instruction had placed authority in her hands. The palace then released a negotiated settlement. William and Camilla had reached an agreement under which she voluntarily abandoned any legal challenge and accepted a separate permanent household. The revelation softened some criticism, but it also confirmed that the exclusion was final. Outside Windsor's Henry VII Gate, a crowd gathered beneath the newspaper billboard carrying the headline, "The Queen's Last Command." At exactly noon, the castle flag rose as Camilla's car passed without entering, and the silent crowd watched the vehicle continue down the long walk. Inside the car, she saw the headline, closed her eyes for one breath, then sat upright before the cameras could capture her pain. Ahead waited one final appearance at Windsor, where she would enter only as an invited consort. The country had delivered its reaction, but the meaning of the clause would be decided by the family's final return to Windsor and by the dignity each person carried through the gate. The final test came not inside a courtroom or a solicitor's office, but at Windsor itself. Camilla returned for a memorial service under the terms she had accepted, not as resident, not as household authority, but as the king's consort and a member of the family. Every step carried the weight of rejection. Yet what happened before she departed transformed the clause from a weapon of humiliation into a boundary the monarchy could finally survive. Camilla entered through the public ceremonial entrance, and officials recorded that her visit would last only for the service. A ceremonial entrance is the official route used for royal duties, not private residence. Windsor was no longer a place she could call home. Charles stood beside her, making one truth unmistakable. Respecting his mother's instruction did not require abandoning his wife or denying her dignity. Camilla paused near the corridor leading toward the former private apartments. She knew she would never cross that threshold again as part of her household. Anne approached without triumph. The Princess Royal admitted that enforcing the clause had caused pain, but insisted their shared duty was to prevent personal authority from consuming the institution they inherited. Camilla answered with quiet finality. She would never seek Windsor access again. Then she handed Anne a signed confirmation dissolving the proposed Queen Consort's unit, the staff structure that would have given her permanent influence inside the castle. William had ordered the East Terrace rooms preserved as part of Queen Elizabeth's historical household. The future king also approved a separate residence where Camilla could serve beside Charles without competing for Windsor's legacy. Before leaving, Camilla placed her signed renunciation on a small table beneath Queen Elizabeth's portrait. Anne took the document, but instead of immediately turning away, she offered her hand. Camilla accepted it. Charles watched in silence as the two women released years of hostility without pretending the pain never existed. Queen Elizabeth's clause didn't destroy the monarchy, and it didn't end Charles and Camilla's marriage. What it actually did was create a boundary between love and duty. Windsor remained protected. The marriage survived. Anne fulfilled her mother's command. William guarded the inheritance he carries, and Camilla chose dignity over a battle she couldn't win. She lost the castle that might have confirmed acceptance. Yet by refusing revenge, she gained something authority could never command: respect. The gates closed behind Camilla for the final time as a would-be resident, and Windsor remained exactly where Queen Elizabeth had placed it, beyond possession, beyond marriage, and protected for the generations.